Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is November 15th, 2021. This is podcast number 71. I'm happy to have you back. This is another podcast about crime. This season, we're talking about crime from a philosophical standpoint. But today the conversation is going to be about the concept of natural and spiritual explanations to understand crime. Crime could be understood as either a natural phenomenon. It is within you. It's something that you have in your nature. It's part of your being. And the concept of spiritual crime is this idea that something other than motivates individuals to commit crime, and that something other than is spiritual in nature. It's something that is sort of almost mysterious, and it's this idea that those two reasons, those two causes could explain why individuals engage in criminal conduct. And we talked about this from a philosophical standpoint because there are implications to those understandings. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. When we are talking about crime in terms of its underpinnings, there are two sort of basic components, at least two basic concepts that try to explain crime. There are two sort of school of thought that try to explain crime. The first one is the concept of a spiritual explanation, and the second concept is what one would call a natural explanation as to what crime is. Now, when we are talking about a spiritual explanation about crime, what we are talking about here is this idea that there are certain events, there are certain realities that are out of this world that control a person's behavior. So in other words, the person is possessed by this spirit, out of the world spirit or entity. The individual does not own himself. The individual is perhaps entranced, right? The individual is under the influence of this or that. The individual is sort of under the control of some external, and usually it is something out of this world, something that cannot be explained. A spirit, or out of this world being sort of that guide the behavior of this individual. So that is the spiritual understanding of what crime is. Okay? So when you have this sort of understanding as to what crime is, the belief is that crime is not a natural event. Crime is something that sort of came from somewhere. So this person is possessed by this spirit, and that is why the person engaged in this particular conduct. That is why this person does this, does that. And then there's always a religious component to that understanding, to the extent that, God or whatever the good spirit would be could sort of get rid of the bad spirit in the individual, right? The idea of doing all sorts of rituals on the individual to sort of make sure that the bad spirit leaves the individual to the extent that the individual can no longer engage in criminal behavior or in behaviors that could be deemed criminal. So there's always this religious undertone to this understanding that there's a need to stop these individuals, and to do that we have to appeal to the good spirit. We have to appeal to God, okay, to sort of stop this evil, to remove this evil, right, in this individual. The other explanation to crime, at least the other understanding of crime, is the concept of natural explanations. And that understanding entails that crimes are natural to the extent that they are based on things or moments of events that are present in the natural world. Okay? In other words, crimes are the result of the tangible reality that the individual experiences. So that worldview, sort of based on the Greek traditions, as to, there are certain good in nature, but there are also certain bad in nature. And those sort of influence the individual to behave either in a good way or in a bad way. Of course, it is still sort of the result of this material man, this good, righteous man, who is sort of imbued with the capacity to be either good or evil. It is intrinsic in the person to be good, but there are individuals who, for some reason, let themselves convince to become evil. So the person is no longer sort of able to sort of be in charge of his righteousness. And the person becomes immoral, incapable of sort of do good. And at that point, the person becomes a criminal, because the person sort of relinquished themselves to the evil that is part of the world, that is part of the natural environment where the individual evolves, right? So the concept of natural explanation is this idea that this person is imbued with the capacity to do good and also to do bad. But the individual, for some reason, is not able to control his malice or his evil, but is sort of taken a hostage by this ill, okay? And the person becomes bad. He becomes the embodiment of what is evil, what is not good, what is not righteous. Okay. The concept of sort of natural explanations to crime embodied this understanding that the individual is righteous at his core. Okay. At his core beingness, the individual is righteous. Nonetheless, the individual is also able to sort of do evil. Okay. And the evil doer is a criminal. Okay. But there are other explanations as to why crime occur or why people engage in criminal conduct. Some of those explanations we could sort of include a scientific explanation, right? What all these theories are trying to do is they're trying to sort of give you a scientific understanding as to what crime is and who engage in such a conduct. And they're trying to sort of establish a relationship between a behavior and a tendency in the person, right? So you are a criminal because somehow, or for some reason, you sort of are likely to be this way, either because it's your nature, or maybe it is because some unworldly event or a reality that are sort of affecting you. And the understanding is that whatever you do can be measured. We can measure your behavior, we can measure your conduct, we can measure the effects of your conduct, and to that extent, we can say with certainty that you are a criminal if you engage in such a conduct. So of course, there are other understandings about what crime is, but let us stay within this parameters. Now, the reason this is important in terms of philosophy is that crime sort of undermines the person. At least these understandings about crime undermine the person at his core, because it doesn't take into account the fact that the person is influenced by not only events, but also by his nature. So although there are certain elements or certain realities which might explain the reason a person behaves in this or that way, but there's also the nature of this person. And if we were to look at the concept of crime from a philosophical standpoint, the irrefutable conclusion is that the concept is flawed, because it is based on flawed assumptions about human beings. Whether we're talking about crime based on unworldly influences, or we're talking about crime based on natural influences, it is also assumed that the person has absolutely no inherent self, in terms of the person has a way of being which on its own could be criminal, so long as that way of being is defined as such. And to illustrate this understanding, let us say that crime is defined as a spiritual explanation. In other words, you were possessed by this evil spirit, and that is why you went out there and stole this orange, or this mango, or this pack of whatever it is that you stole. That's because you were possessed. You were not yourself. Had you been yourself, you would not have gone out there and steal something. Well, it undermines the fact that then the individual might be in a situation where stealing, what is a conduct that could be deemed a theft, is a natural conduct for the individual. The person did not invent a means to go get that orange or those oranges. If I reach out to a tree and grab an orange, which as per our societal definition of possession is not my possession, so I could be deemed a criminal because my act could be deemed a crime. Thus, the fact of reaching out to a tree and grab an orange is something so extraordinary that I would have to possess some unworldly spirit or capacities to do it. But let's use the same example. If we're going to use a natural explanation as to crime, the fact that I reach out to a tree, an orange tree, and grab an orange and eat it, does not mean that I am inherently evil to reach to that tree to grab that orange to eat it. The theories, at least the explanations that are given, would certainly suggest so. Would it be possible that I am hungry? Is it possible that the fact that I reach out to a tree has nothing extraordinary in it? In other words, any man who has an extension, an extremity, like legs and arms and hands, could reach out and grab the orange. So the fact of reaching out and grabbing the orange has nothing, I would say, unworldly to it, therefore is not unnatural, therefore does not suggest that I am possessed by an evil spirit or not. Yet that behavior, at least that conduct, that act, could be deemed criminal. And in most modern societies, I could lose my freedom. I could even lose my life, or perhaps lose my hands for it, based on the explanation that we as a society have come up with to define the conduct. Okay? So what a man does is always within his nature. Now, whether or not we deem that nature good or bad, that's a construction. In other words, we construe that behavior to be either good or bad, because there's no such thing in nature. Nature does not have good or bad in it. And we've talked about this in other podcasts, the concept of duality, looking at everything from two lenses, looking at everything from this or that. Nature is blurry. In the natural, what is good could also be perceived as bad. What is righteous could also be perceived as evil, depending on the context or the circumstances where this action or this conduct is being perpetrated. So we, as members of society, unable to understand ourselves within the society, have come up with explanations to explain, at least to make sense of our behavior, our reaction to our nature. And this has huge implication for the human species, because crime, the concept of crime, is an implication of our incapacity to understand who we are. Now, of course, as Jean-Paul Sartre would say, bad faith could be a part of it, because we know, and usually the people who judge others, they're the worst. They're the worst kind of human beings you've ever met in your life. Most judges are corrupt to a point where it's not even relevant to talk about them. Most police officers are corrupt to a point where it doesn't even make sense for them to try to enforce rule of law based on morality. But yet that's what we have in society. Now the question is, what are the implications for the man? What are the implications for the person? Well, the implications are dire. Like I said, a person could lose his freedom. A person could lose his life because his behavior is defined as such. So the point here is that despite the theories that I've talked about, a crime in and of itself, philosophically speaking, is normal. It is not the person who is wrong. It is not the conduct that is wrong. Rather, it is our interpretation of it that is wrong. Reaching out to an orange tree and grab an orange is not wrong, so long as we don't say that it is. The minute we say that it is, then it is wrong. But the conduct itself is not wrong, but our interpretation, our definition of it is. And therefore, our conduct is only wrong when we say that it is. So on the outset, a crime is normal. It's natural. It's a normal behavior. But we as a society deem it like this. I always use a trivial example to sort of make sense of this whenever I get to that point. Let us say that you live in a forest, somewhere in Amazonia and whatnot, okay? Where it's you and the elements. It's you, nature, and that's it. Would crime be relevant then? No, it wouldn't be. Because in such an environment, there would be no need to define crime. There would be no need for it. The reason crime is relevant is because we are unaware or incapable of appreciating who we are. And because we're unable to appreciate who we are, it makes sense. It makes perfect sense to try to vilify ourselves. Because it makes it easier to get rid of those we cannot deal with. It makes it easier to get rid of those we are unable to tame, to control. So you have to look at crime from this concept. You have to look at crime from the understanding that the conduct itself is not wrong. Rather, we deem the conduct wrong. And that is why sometimes a conduct that was deemed wrong at a particular point in time, at another point is not deemed as such. Or a conduct that was deemed right at a particular point in time, at some point becomes a wrong. So the conduct itself never changed, but our interpretation of it changed. So if 20 years ago, I did this, or let's use marijuana or cannabis. In the early 1900s, cannabis was not illegal. There was nothing wrong with smoking pot. But all the way through the 1980s until recently now, it was wrong. And there are so many people that are in jail for doing just that. Others are in jail for just having it. Just having that cannabis somewhere on their possession, on their person or in their home. There are so many individuals that are in jail right now for that. Is it right? Is it right for them to be in jail? Absolutely not. But again, let's go back to the implications. There are people that have lost their freedom, that have lost the right to exist as a person. They have lost those rights because they had a pack of marijuana on their person, at the time they interacted with someone who was deemed a law enforcer or a police or a judge and whatnot. So those are the implications we have to look into. Those are the implications we have to consider whenever we're talking about crime, because the implications for the person could be dire. And they are usually dire. So whenever we're talking about crime in terms of, the natural explanations for it or the spiritual explanations for it, but the philosophical underpinnings must also be considered, or we must also take into account the philosophical underpinning, because the philosophical explanation for crime is that a crime is a natural behavior. It's a normal behavior. Everybody commits that behavior or engages in that behavior. Therefore, everybody is a criminal as so defined. The only difference is that there are those who decide who are criminal and those who have no power but to accept it. Those are the differences. So philosophically speaking, a crime is not a wrong. Rather, it is defined as such. It is understood as such. Okay? And whenever it is understood as such, most people who engage in such a conduct will be deemed a criminal. But there are individuals who engage in such a conduct egregiously sometimes will not be deemed a criminal. They will not be deemed a criminal, and simply because somebody said that they're not a criminal. And those are sort of the fundamentals of what crime is in terms of crime theories.